What if the key to healing the absolute deepest wounds of modern warfare has literally been growing in the dirt for millennia? Well, welcome to The Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled to have you here today because we are breaking down a truly fascinating, deeply important subject. We're going to explore the complex neuroscience behind veteran PTSD, and specifically, we're looking at why a brand new pharmacological intervention is showing this completely unprecedented convergence with the biological realities of combat trauma. So if you want to understand the exact cellular mechanisms of how the brain might actually be healed, you are definitely in the right place. Okay, let's dive into this by anchoring our entire discussion in one really stark, undeniable number, 17.6. Derived from the 2024 and 2025 VA reports, this represents the average number of veteran suicides every single day in the U.S. I mean, to put that into perspective, that's over 6,000 lives lost annually. It's a daily rate that has stubbornly hovered around this mark for 2 solid decades. This isn't just a statistic. This is the immediate life or death stakes of the science we're about to unpack today. So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the sheer scale of the veteran health crisis, followed by the treatment gap that's leaving so many behind. Then, we'll unpack the 4 exact neural mechanisms of healing, tackle the heavy question of moral injury, examine the emerging clinical data, and finally map out the regulatory horizon. Section 1. The veteran health crisis, a daily tragedy. You know, despite decades of dedicated effort, billions in funding, and the really hard work of countless clinicians, standard psychiatric care just hasn't closed the gap for our veterans. The reality? We're seeing a roughly 50% treatment failure rate in veteran PTSD across standard SSRI medications and trauma-focused psychotherapy. And when you look at prolonged exposure therapies, the dropout rates range anywhere from 38.5% to a staggering 65%. This traps a lot of veterans, especially the 1 in 4 who screen positive for probable traumatic brain injury, in this relentless, ineffective polypharmacy cycle. Basically, it becomes a revolving door where they fail a first-line SSRI, move to a second, maybe add a sleep medication, an antipsychotic, and often an opioid for chronic pain. It just piles on side effects without ever actually resolving the root trauma. Section 2. Why standard care fails. The treatment gap. Now, as focused learners, we always have to ask why. And this brilliantly illustrates the distinct biological mismatch between what our current treatments target and what combat trauma actually breaks. Standard care, like your typical SSRIs, generally targets just 1 or 2 nodes in the brain, like serotonin reuptake. But on the flip side, neuroscience shows that combat trauma damages 4 distinct neural systems simultaneously. It's kind of like trying to reboot an entire crashed computer network by just changing a single wire. You simply cannot fix a 4-system systemic network failure with a single node approach. It just doesn't work. Section 3. Psilocybin's 4 neural mechanisms. A systemic recovery. So looking at this purely from a neutral neuroscientific perspective, psilocybin has emerged in the literature as the very first pharmacological intervention demonstrated to engage all 4 of these damaged neural systems in a single dose. We are unpacking measurable structural brain network changes here. This isn't just about subjective feelings of wellness, right? We're talking about physical, observable shifts in neurobiology across these 4 mechanisms. Let's break them down. Mechanism 1 is resetting the amygdala. In combat PTSD, the amygdala gets stuck in chronic hyperreactivity. It's just constantly scanning for danger. Brain imaging shows that psilocybin acutely dampens this threat response while the drug is active. But remarkably, post-treatment, we see a recalibration. Instead of just chronically blunting all emotions like an SSRI might do, psilocybin actually restores prefrontal authority over the amygdala. It essentially puts the brain's rational manager back in charge of the panic button, which lets the veterans safely engage with their feelings and reopen their emotional bandwidth. Mechanism 2 involves the default mode network, or the DMN. This is the brain network anchoring your sense of self, your autobiographical memory, the whole narrative of who you are. In PTSD, the DMN becomes pathologically coupled to the anterior hippocampus, which is the brain's deep memory vault. What that means is the veteran literally cannot access their sense of self without also retrieving the trauma. But a landmark 2024 study in Nature showed that psilocybin actually uncouples the DMN from the anterior hippocampus for weeks. This structural change loosens that rigid, trauma-bound self-narrative, creating this incredibly crucial window for deep psychological repair. Moving on to Mechanism 3, rebuilding the fear-extinction circuit. At a cellular level, PTSD is fundamentally a failure to extinguish fear at a very specific synapse between the infralimbic prefrontal cortex and the basolateral amygdala. Psilocybin doesn't just encourage learning, it drives actual structural plasticity. Studies show a 10% increase in dendritic spine density in the frontal cortex. Let that sink in. That means literally growing new microscopic branches to form new connections within 24 hours of a dose. It physically grows the neural architecture needed to reopen that critical learning window so the brain can finally learn, okay, I am safe. And finally, mechanism 4 is quieting neuroinflammation. Years of chronic combat stress severely dysregulate the nervous system, which primes microglial cells into this pro-inflammatory state. This internal inflammatory storm causes real physical pain and drives comorbid depression. But research demonstrates that psilocin, the active metabolite of psilocybin, actively suppresses the cytokine release at the cellular level through 5-HT and AR signaling pathways. Think of it as physically turning off the neuroinflammatory fire alarm inside the brain. Section 4, the moral injury question, a heavy psychological toll. Beyond the hyperarousal of PTSD, we absolutely have to discuss the uniquely heavy psychological weight carried by an estimated 25 to 50% of combat veterans. Moral injury. It's defined as the profound guilt, shame, and self-revulsion that arises from violating your own moral code in combat. As one veteran researcher powerfully put it, it's often described as the feeling of losing your soul in the line of duty. And here is why this matters neurologically. Brain imaging reveals moral injury is encoded in the default mode network, not the fear-based amygdala. Because standard exposure therapies target the fear circuit, they completely miss moral injury. But psilocybin, which profoundly uncouples the DMN, like we just discussed, aligns perfectly with the biological substrate of where moral injury actually lives in the brain. Section 5. Emerging clinical data. Real-world outcomes. Now, what is really interesting here is when we ground all this dense neuroscience in actual real-world outcomes, the results are pretty staggering. In a December 2025 open-label trial from the Mount Sinai and Bronx VA Medical Center looking at U.S. veterans with severe treatment-resistant depression, these are often considered the absolute hardest to treat cases. A single dose resulted in an incredibly impressive 60% response rate and a 53% full remission rate at just 3 weeks. To complement that, observational data from the Heroic Hearts Project covering 58 veterans showed a 29% drop in depression scores and a 26% drop in PTSD scores, alongside significant improvements in sleep and overall quality of life. That's a real game changer. But hey, let's be totally honest here. Strict impartial science requires us to state what hasn't been proven yet. Currently, no large veteran-specific randomized controlled trial has been fully published for psilocybin and PTSD. We are still largely extrapolating from civilian phase 3 trials. And interestingly, data actually shows that chronic SSRI use blunts the efficacy of psilocybin, so veterans require a carefully supervised medical taper before even participating in trials. The science is incredibly convergent, for sure, but the gold standard randomized veteran data, it's still in the pipeline. Section 6, the path forward, the regulatory horizon. Across the United States, we are neutrally observing a massive, rapid expansion of the regulatory infrastructure for psychedelic research, and it's backed by a really remarkable coalition across all political lines. This shift is happening incredibly fast. Check out this timeline. In December 2023, the bipartisan NDAA allocated $10 million for active duty research. By January 2025, Colorado's Prop 122 established state-level access pathways. Fast forward to November 2025, an active network of 9 VA facilities began running treatment protocols. And in April 2026, a presidential executive order unlocked over $50 million in HHS funding. The federal and state infrastructure to research and access these treatments exists right now, in 2026, in a way that simply did not exist in 2022. Which leaves us with its final, truly provocative question. What is the cost of waiting for absolutely perfect data versus acting on this overwhelming convergent science? When we remember that 17.6 veteran lives are lost every single day, the urgency of this mechanism, the cellular structural reopening of the brain's ability to heal, well, it becomes impossible to ignore. Thank you so much for bringing your curiosity and focus to the explainer today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I will see you next time.